is our Dharma? What is our quest? Welcome to Dharma Nights. I'm your host, Matt Murphy, and today I thought I would do a little bit of story time in honor of my friend Phil, who's a friend of mine from many years, and he's been listening to my podcast. He shared some feedback with me that, of course, he's like sort of baseline level interested in many of the things I have to say relating to my martial arts journey, but maybe is a little bit harder for him to relate to because it's just not really part of his world. But the Hindu and yoga related philosophy stuff is very much of interest to him. And it's very easy for me to understand that this might also be the position of many others, especially with a title for the podcast like Dharma Nights. So I will occasionally have to sort of cash the check that I put out there in terms of naming this podcast what I named it. And today I'll do that with story time, not necessarily about the Bhagavad Gita, but there's lots of materials out there that talk about the Bhagavad Gita. It's one of the most well-discussed pieces of sacred writing out there, and that doesn't mean that I won't discuss it from time to time. I certainly will. I might not always be in the mood to do that, though, like just to put it bluntly. Something that is very much more of interest to me is talking about things from the Mahabharata, which is the larger story, which encases the Bhagavad Gita as a sub-story within it, right? So the story I thought I would share today is one that I also share in many of my yoga teacher training lectures, and it's the story of Ekalavya. And who is Ekalavya? Ekalavya is what is called a nishada, or sort of a like tribal person in this period of the Mahabharata, which is like supposed to be sort of like Vedic Iron Age, right? And in this backdrop, there's a caste system in its early form, which is really not unlike a lot of the other hierarchically arranged societies contemporaneous with that one of the time, right? You have a ruling class, which is also the military class, right? And they have the sort of duty and obligation to do defense of their own kingdom and borders and so forth. And to one extent or another, maybe also like the obligation to defend whoever lives within their borders, right? And then you have the priestly class, and in this framework, those are the Brahmins. So the warriors are the Kshatriyas, with kind of a silent K at the beginning, although I do periodically say the K, and you'll have to forgive me for that. But we have the Kshatriyas, who's the warrior, kingly class, and then you have the Brahmins, they're the priestly class. And for the most part, you have just everybody else who's actually in that ethnic society. And then you have the outsiders. And in a sense, they have like the smallest station in that society, because technically they are not supposed to have a station in that society because they are outsiders, right? So some people make an assumption that they would fall under the deletes category, which is sort of like the untouchable class, usually descendants of slaves or prisoners by some reckonings. And that is also not necessarily true. Many would simply just reply, no, that they don't have a caste name. They're just foreigners, right? And tribals in this case would have been just completely outside the caste system, which in many senses would also mean that they are sort of below it. So there's this tribal person named Ekalavya, who's the son of the tribal chief. And one day he's in the forest and he sees these young princes being trained by their martial arts guru. The young princes here are being trained in archery. They are the Pandavas and the Kauravas, who will later be the two warring factions in the Bhagavad Gita story, right, at the Battle of Kurukshetra. And their martial arts guru is actually a Brahmin priest named Drona. And we're going to come back to why it's so unusual that a Brahmin priest is somehow a martial arts guru for anyone, and there are a handful of exceptional cases in these stories where that happens, and each with very different implications. But in the short term here, this tribal prince sees this incredible instruction of archery. And as a tribal person, he's also obviously dependent on archery in this system as a hunter, right? But as he's watching this incredible instruction, he sort of stealthily imitates the lessons that are being taught. In some versions of the story, he actually approaches Drona for instruction and is rejected. And in some versions of the stories, he doesn't actually approach. But what he does do is he goes back to his own sort of secret spot to do his own training. And he fashions an idol, sort of, out of clay in the shape of this martial arts guru Drona, as if making a sort of teacher who's watching him and instructing him while he practices in private. But the implication is that he never actually receives instruction from Drona. And aside from maybe an initial chance happening where he can see in that first moment some instruction, even though he's not personally receiving any of it, the implication is that he's not actually getting any instruction. But he teaches himself. And in the process of teaching himself, he actually achieves excellence. And if we rewind one more time to this character Drona and his pupils, his star pupil is Arjuna, who in the Bhagavad Gita is the character being given instruction by Krishna when he's experiencing that existential dread and, his doubt about what he should be doing, and when it's dawning on him that he's going to have to slaughter his own family members. And then the whole Bhagavad Gita is basically the explanation of why he should get over that apprehension and take action, right? So Arjuna, as a child, extracts a promise from his martial arts guru Drona that says, Drona basically promises to make him the best archer, that he will be without equal. And Arjuna, even though he has many virtues and is an excellent character, his central flaw is his pride and his insecurity about being the best, like the best warrior, best archer, whatever, certainly the best archer. Fast forward after a long period of time where Ekalavya, this tribal boy, has been basically teaching himself how to be the best archer and teaching himself other martial arts as the other boys would be, just as if he was also one of the students of Drona. And in this moment, the Pandavas happen to be hunting, and they're still youths at this point. They take their hunting dogs into the forest to hunt, and they're barking, and this disturbs Ekalavya in his practice. So he performs a miraculous feat of archery based on the skill from his own self-instruction, right? And this action is basically him shooting a bunch of arrows in the dog's mouth, not through the mouth, not like piercing the dog, but like jamming the dog's mouth open with arrows in between it so that he can no longer bark. And all the dog lovers in the room absolutely hate that part of the story, but just as a side note. So when the Pandavas, and in particular Arjuna, come around and see this feat, they see the dog has been shot, his mouth has been jammed open by arrows. Arjuna sees this and he realizes that this is a feat of archery above his own capability at that moment. And he goes back to Drona and he says, Drona, you lied. You didn't keep your promise. There's an archer out there who is able to perform this miraculous feat of archery. And Drona says, we'll see about that. And he goes towards the source of this miraculous feat and finds Ekalavya practicing archery and martial arts in front of the guru idol that Ekalavya made of Drona. So in other words, like, here comes Drona. He sees this boy practicing martial arts, but what he also sees is a clay statue of his own likeness. And Ekalavya, upon seeing the real-life Drona, immediately bows and pays reverence and respect and says, "Oh, my beloved guru, my teacher, I'll ask anything. I'll do anything. I'm so grateful for your teaching." And Drona sort of makes the connection in his mind, like, oh, he's constructed this idol of me and learned at the feet of this idol, even though he was like teaching himself. And Drona says, "If I'm your guru, then you must pay me dakshina," which is sort of like, whatever price the guru extracts for his instruction. And very often it would be asked after the fact, not before, which is like a peculiarity of this kind of model. But he says, "If I'm your guru, you must pay me dakshina." And Ekalavya says, "Ask me anything. It is yours, O beloved guru." And Drona says, "Give me the thumb off of your shooting hand." And without hesitation, Ekalavya takes his hunting knife and cuts off his thumb and hands it to Drona reverently. And this story disturbs people when I tell them. There's many stories in this overall Mahabharata epic that when I tell them disturb people. Just as many fill them with wonder, just as many keep them intrigued and make them want to hear more. But pretty reliably, whenever I tell this story, people are like, "What is the meaning of that?" And they're sort of flabbergasted by it. So part of the reason I tell it is because it's so productive to unpack it. And another part of the reason I enjoy it is because of the reaction that it gets, I won't lie. And yet another reason is because I have a lot of personal investment in this story as it resonates in my own life. So now we can kind of get to some of the unpacking a little bit. One of the first things to understand is that this story is set in a framework where there is a guru model. And that's a very unfamiliar learning model to pretty much everyone in the West, unless they've had some sort of very difficult apprenticeship, or unless they've joined a cult, basically. So this guru model, the teacher is supposed to be a stand-in for gods, in a sense. It's not that they're not a flawed human. It's not all these other things, but in the capacity as teacher, they become less of a person, less of an individual, and more of sort of a proxy for God as an education point, like God as a transfer of knowledge, right? So they'll very often address the teacher as Guru Dev, meaning like Dev having some sort of cognate of like, divine significance. So they're basically saying like, they're addressing them as divine teacher with all the same reverence and all that sort of thing. And there's something in common with the attitude with which someone would lay an offering at a puja or an altar. There's something in common with that sense of reverence as there would be with greeting your instructor, your guru, and like sort of paying them honor at their feet, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. One of the big takeaways that is often cited here is that Drona was punishing Ekalavya for quote unquote stealing knowledge. And to me, that is a very unsatisfactory answer. And it seems like sort of a rationalized one. And it also doesn't take into account sort of a larger understanding of Drona's character in this story. Just to fill in some of those details. So Drona as a character, I mentioned earlier that he is a Brahmin priest who is somehow or another a martial arts and war guru, which is already a very strange thing. There's only a handful of other Brahmins in these stories who take on that role. Very often they're villains. One instance of it, however, is actually one of the other incarnations of Vishnu, named Parshuram, who happens to be Drona's original teacher. So Parshuram, there's like stories within stories within stories whenever you talk about this larger framework of the Mahabharata, which is why I originally fell in love with it, right? But this incarnation of Vishnu, Parshuram, was a Brahmin priest whose father was illegitimately murdered by tyrannical kings. And Parshuram went on basically a massacre spree with his axe, where he killed almost an entire generation of Kshatriyas or warrior kings, right? With the exception of one who hid in the women's garment closet, basically. And that's a statement on kind of like the ultimate, like, it's sort of a way of saying, like, all you warrior kings are ultimately descended from one coward who hid themselves in a bunch of dresses. And like all of the implications of that are pretty obvious, right? But Parshuram, this incarnation of Vishnu, is like one of the archetype of the original kill a priest. Kind of like in the Wu-Tang songs, they talk about kill a priests. Like, the Shaolin priests who go on killing sprees and all that sort of thing. He is the original archetype of that, right? So the reason for doing it is that in the larger sense, Vishnu periodically comes to Earth in an avatar form whenever the Earth is saturated with corruption and adharma, meaning like the opposite of dharma. And he either personally comes to clean things up, or he comes to play a mentor role and sort of a behind-the-scenes manipulator, and I mean that with all due respect and honor, right? But one way or another, he's there to help clean up the corruption of the earth. And this is one of those stories where the reason for massacring an entire generation of Kshatriyas and turning an entire river red with their blood is because they were so corrupt, and that sort of thing just periodically has to happen with the ruling class, right? But in any case, after this massacre, Parshuram, he is one of the handful of seemingly immortal characters in this set of stories, and he even meets other incarnations of Vishnu. Like Vishnu as incarnation of Parshuram meets Vishnu incarnation as Ram later on, which is a story I won't get into, but it's like very entertaining. And even later, Parshuram also meets Krishna as an incarnation of Vishnu. So it's sort of like Vishnu meeting incarnations of himself simultaneously. And that's always a very wonderful detail to talk about. But Parshuram hates Kshatriyas, just absolutely hates them. And he, in his hermitage, he'll periodically take on martial arts students so long as they're not Kshatriyas, and so long as they never teach their art to Kshatriyas. That's the condition of people coming to learn from him. So Drona, who's also a Brahmin, just like Parshuram, Drona ends up coming to Parshuram for martial arts instruction because he's so humiliated at a moment when a bunch of his sons, his like little child, his son's friends are all making fun of him for being so poor that he didn't know the difference between rice milk and actual cow milk. And he's just in dire poverty as a Brahmin who isn't even really successful at getting alms. And he's so motivated by this poverty that he goes back to a grown-up king who he was childhood friends with. And when the king as a child said, much in the spirit of things that kids say to one another, "Oh, I'll give you half of my kingdom when we grow up." And quite absurdly, but also out of desperation, once Drona becomes an adult in this humiliating moment of poverty, he actually goes to collect on that promise. And the king offers him like a cow or two as alms, but says, "You can't possibly expect a childhood promise like that to be honored. That's ridiculous." Quite correctly, right? But Drona approaches him with that apparent debt rather than in friendship or in the spirit of asking for alms as would be appropriate for a Brahmin. And when he's refused, Drona becomes motivated by revenge and seeks out this martial arts instruction from Parshuram, who makes him extract an oath that he'll never teach any of this stuff to Kshatriyas, right? And what is the very first thing Drona does once he graduates from his apprenticeship with Parshuram? He immediately goes to the royal palace to become a martial arts guru for the Pandavas and the Kauravas. Immediately. And specifically the dakshina that he plans to collect from them once he raises them to be these perfect warriors, is that he's going to have them collect by conquest half of the kingdom of his childhood friend who refused him the output of that childhood oath, right? So that's a lot to unpack there, but that's basically me saying, like, these stories are already saying that Drona has gone down a fundamentally flawed path, because he was born for a life of peace as a Brahmin and a life of sharing knowledge and performing sacred rituals and these sorts of things. And he chooses a life of warfare and like being a martial arts guru to other warriors, right? And he does so in violation of the oath that he took to Parshuram, who is an incarnation of Vishnu. So now we go back to that moment where people are like, what could that moment possibly mean when he's cutting off the thumb of Ekalavya? And I said earlier that one of the answers that people give is that, particularly if they're very like pious, right, and they don't quite fully understand that you're not really supposed to 100% admire Drona. You're supposed to see that there's a flaw in his development as a character, and he's like kind of a cautionary tale. But that can be a bit challenging, because all the characters in these, not all, but many of the characters in these stories, even when they become adversaries, are still owed reverence for one or another reason. And I would say, like, the character of Drona is owed some reverence, but not reverence that excludes a little bit of judgment that says they went down a wrong path. I think you are supposed to have a combination of reverence, but also recognition that they took a wrong turn. But anyway, this act of telling Ekalavya to cut his thumb off as his dakshina, or his guru fee, I don't see as an act of punishment for stolen knowledge, although any societal system that has a guru system has a motivation in sharing that interpretation, right? Because, like, gurus got to make a living. People can't be out there stealing the guru's knowledge and job. Although I would argue that nothing can take the job of a guru, even in a world where all information is free. A guru they'll still be employed all day long. You can't really get around the need for like a live teacher to help you piece things together, even if the information itself is everywhere. But I think one of the interpretations is that it is just flat out an act of cruelty with economic motivations, right? And I think that's not a viewpoint unique to me. I think that is an inbuilt criticism of how the guru system can go wrong. Because it's supposed to be a sacred institution when it works correctly. But as we've all seen in this modern world with like some of the sex abuse scandals in a lot of the yoga groups, and anytime there's sort of an East meets West sort of cult that develops with a guru figure coming to the West, like in a society where that it's not even really their society, like and the model just doesn't really work in the same way there. And because it's not quite a fit, it becomes like rife with abuse as a potential, right? So for me, one of the outputs of this story, there's many outputs. There's so many different takeaways from this story that you can take, which is why I share it. But another one is you can actually gain all those skills that Ekalavya did with motivated enough self-instruction. Like, people do it all the time. That is one of the takeaways, that for better or worse, and this story in a certain sense argues for worse, but for better or worse, you can achieve something like that. Like, you can become sort of a self-guru in a way. And some people can do that. And some people do that all the time. Like, there's cases of people becoming self-taught at some one or another very complicated discipline, but they do it. Sometimes they might seek out resources that are not a live teacher. You know, they might find books, or if we're talking about ancient practices, they might find old scrolls or something, and the old scrolls will say, you know, kind of like in the Book of Five Rings, the samurai swordsman text, they'll say like, hey, you need a teacher to unpack these. And I agree that in many cases you do, but I wouldn't say every case. And any of my IT worker friends will immediately identify with this idea of self-taught competency, not only as something that you can do, but in those fields, you have to do that. It's just required. Like, people do it all the time. And in a certain sense, there's almost a little bit of disdain or failure to win credibility if you don't do that kind of thing, if you are not one of those self-learners. So that's one of the takeaways for me. One of the other takeaways is and I'm not sure if this was intentional or not, but there's the story of building the idol of a teacher is sort of a case of what, like, many life coach programs and other, like, personal development models would call using an avatar. And the meaning of avatar is different. It's very different than the one that I mentioned earlier. It's more like, in this particular case, it's saying, like, if you were to imagine that, let me back up. So a good definition of avatar in this case, as I mean it here, would be something like the "What Would Jesus Do" bracelets, where someone might not necessarily have their own fully fleshed out sense of what they should do, but they call upon a model based on, like, the example that was set in stories about Jesus or whatever. And they're like, okay, well, based on what I know about all these stories and these scriptures, what would Jesus do here? Even if I don't personally know what to do here, let me construct a little model of Jesus in my own mind for a moment based on what I've learned and say, what would Jesus do? So that's basically what Ekalavya does with this clay statue of the guru. He constructs a model of a guru in his mind and said, how would a guru guide me in this case? What's the sort of thing that a guru would be likely to say to keep me more focused on my training, to keep me learning as well as I can? And that technique 100% works. It absolutely works. So that's another takeaway. And this is something that in my own jiu-jitsu training, right, I've had teachers at many different points, and I'm very grateful for them. But the times where I learned the most is when I made a self-directed study. And I looked for information, I put it together in my own unique way, and that's when my progress made leaps and bounds. But the other part of this is it would have been impossible without having at least the environment that a teacher had set up, even if they weren't personally there. Like, in other words, they gave me keys to their dojo, they gave me access to their facilities, they gave me access to their students that I could do stuff in my own time. Like, we could kind of collaboratively get together on our own time. So, in a sense, like, the idol of the teacher was there, even if they weren't personally the one doing it, like the instruction. And even if I wasn't actually thinking to myself, what would my teacher say here? But, considering that it was in their environment that they put together and with students that they had assembled, like, in many ways, the idol of the teacher was very much looming there, right? Because it was in their space that they had lovingly put together. So that's one of the takeaways for me of this story as well. And we have some reason to think that many people in India hearing this story have very strong feelings in several directions about it. And that happens with many of these characters from the Mahabharata. Like, people will still name their children Karna because many people admire the character of Karna, who is Arjuna's great adversary in the story. Even though he's supposed to be cast as a villain, he has so much sympathy on the part of everyday people because the bad hand that he was dealt in life, and how strong he is as a character, and how generous and how loyal he is as a friend, and all these sorts of things. And Ekalavya, in some ways, is a character just like that. And he does have a temple in India devoted to him. And the Bhagavad Purana, which is one of the, that's like a sort of Krishna devotee text that was written later after the Bhagavad Gita, considerably after. It describes many of the events in Krishna's life. And the Bhagavad Purana talks about the character of Ekalavya being killed by Krishna, as Ekalavya, even though he cut off his archery hand, was still taught himself to, like, shoot with the other hand and nonetheless become a very powerful warrior. And he becomes a general in this character Jarasan's army, and that's someone who is one of Krishna's adversaries. But Krishna kills him in battle, and the thing about being killed by Krishna personally is it is an act of salvation, because it's God taking you off the board. And anyone who is killed by Krishna, or even like dies in his presence, is sort of blessed in their death, right? And in this sort of version of the story as told by the Bhagavad Purana, they say that Ekalavya is reborn as Drishtadyumna, who's the character who eventually kills Drona, that martial arts guru who was corrupt and who asked for his thumb as Dakshina, right? So that's another amazing thing about these stories, is the way that, as they are told and retold over generations by different people, they'll find ways to sort of reincorporate things into this really beautifully woven together tapestry. And that's another really wonderful reason why I share these stories, just because they're the product of such dedicated and beautiful telling and retelling. So I could go on and on and on about this story and why it sticks with me and all of the implications and why I teach it so often in yoga teacher training programs. But I'm going to leave it at a few of the points that I mentioned and just sort of let them marinate. And if you have any interest in these sorts of story materials, there's lots of access points you can get to the materials without having to read the whole Mahabharata text, which for some silly reason I did. But if you dive into this stuff, they have a lot of stories just like this one, where you can look at it from so many different perspectives, and you can kind of like chew on them for a lifetime. And over different periods of your life, you'll realize different things about them, like different dimensions that speak to you in different ways at different times in your life. So for all of my self-motivated learning people out there, I hope you enjoyed this little bit of storytelling about Ekalavya. And, hopefully it has some reinforcing power in your own life, but maybe also gives you a different way to think about some of the dimensions of your own self-learning. And maybe even say, like, in what ways, even in my own self-learning, does the idol of the guru kind of loom in the background in one sense or another? And what does that mean for my own training?